Hi everyone. We're just a couple of weeks short of our bonsai show, and this is a very busy time. What I wanted to show you today is a little bit on how we make dies. These are the wood display stands that we use to display a bonsai either in a bonsai show or whenever it's placed on formal indoor display. This particular die is actually not the right size for this beautiful bougainvillea, but I'm going to make a couple, and in order to do that, first I have to figure out what the right size is for the trees that I want to show. So I put this on here just to kind of test it for size, the same way that you would try on a stock business suit in order to get tailored for one that's custom fitted, and then the tailor gets an idea and takes your measurements. So here we go. This die, which I made several years ago, and I'm going to make one similar but in a different size and show you how I do it. This one is 26 inches wide. Just hold the tape measure right there. And it's about 17 inches from front to back. And it's obviously a bit too large for this tree. Now the exact sizing of the die is an inexact part of the art, and it should be substantial enough to look like it's properly supporting the tree in the pot, large enough to be a little bit under the spread of the tree's branches. So in terms of width, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking somewhere around 21 inches wide, because like I said, this one's just a bit too large. And then front to back, we're at 17 inches here, and we're going to go to maybe 15 inches, which should be enough to give the appearance of substance under the pot and without looking too skimpy. So 15 by 20 or 21, and I'm still just kind of measuring back and forth and getting a feel. So we'll take some notes on that right here. Now I have an elm, which also needs a die. And again, we'll run the tape measure across it. And this one is looking for roughly 20 inches in width. And front to back, 15 inches should be sufficient. So we're going to make two for these trees. One is going to be roughly 15 by 20. The other one I think I'll make slightly larger at around 16 by 21. And we have one more tree that we need to make a die for. So we'll put this one back and we'll go get that third one. This maple also needs a die for this show, but it needs one slightly larger than the other trees due to its greater height. So I've been taking measurements here, and I think we're going to go about 22 inches on the width on this one. And front to back, we're going to go probably somewhere around 16 inches because the pot's a bit more substantial. So from here, we'll go to the garage and we'll start on the woodwork. We're going to make the top of the die from oak plywood, and I have a nice 2 by 4 foot project panel here that I bought at the local big box hardware store. And the first thing we did was we measured off the lines in order to nail down the exact size of it. Now I settled on a size of 16 inches on the short side by 21 inches on the long side, and took those measurements and transferred them using a graphite carpenter's pencil, a steel straight edge, and a little tri-square. And then once we put the measurements on the plywood, we want to check to make sure that we're building a square top and not a parallelogram, and the way we do that is we measure the diagonals. So we lay our straight edge down corner to corner, and we get a diagonal measurement of right around 26 3/8 inches, and then we do the same thing to the other corner and we get the same measurements. So that's how we know that our pre-cut sides are straight and our measurements are straight. Now we'll take the loose stuff off the panel and get ready to cut it. Now before we sign off, we're going to be doing the cutting off camera because a circular saw makes quite a bit of noise, but a couple of things. Safety. Item one, I wear leather work gloves when I use a circular saw because in the unlikely event that I do start to cut myself, the leather will give me that split second before the saw blade bites into my hand, and I'll know something's going wrong and the saw will hang up on it. So it's just common sense. Item 2, never hold your work with your hands. Always clamp your work. I've got a couple of big C clamps, or what the British folks call G clamps, and I've got the panel clamped down good to my workbench so it's nice and stable. And finally, item 3, eye protection. The eyeglasses I'm wearing are using Crizal impact resistant lenses, and so I'm not going to change out of them for this, but if you don't wear eyeglasses and if your eyeglasses don't have good lenses on them, then you might want to consider wearing eye protection when you use a saw like this. Not that it's likely to throw anything really big, but it will throw a lot of sawdust, and if you get some sawdust in your eye and you can't get it out, you may end up having to take a little trip to the local urgent care facility. Now finally, when we cut oak plywood like this, we use a fine-tooth blade on the saw so that we get a very smooth cut, a very fine cut, doesn't require a lot of cleaning or trimming afterwards. This is a 150 tooth blade here. It's designed for fine cuts on hardwood, and so that's what we're going to use it for right here. We're just sanding the edges now that we've cut our pieces to size to make the tops of the dies, and the project panel that we used actually yielded up enough material for 2 medium-sized dies. We have this one on the workbench, and I have this one over here which I've already sanded the sides on, and we'll be doing a little bit more sanding later on, but all we really need to do now is work out the highs and lows on the sides so that when we glue on the trim pieces they fit evenly. The next step, once you get the sides trimmed out, is to take a trim piece, and this is an oak trim piece, again from the big box store. This is called screen bead, and this is what makes it possible to make dies in this way. The width of this is 3/4 of an inch, which is the same as the thickness of the plywood. The next thing we have to do is we have to bevel cut the corners on this and cut it to size. Now this is something where I typically like to just come up and eyeball it because we're not going to be perfect here, and then do the same thing on the other side, and if we get it wrong then we're going to have to recut it, which is why I bought a couple of pieces of this, and I'll buy more if necessary. I'm not going to screw up a die that I'm going to have quite a few hours in over a $6 piece of lumber. So the next thing we do after we measure these pieces is we take our top out of the bench, and then we have to cut the piece with the circular saw. Now, this particular piece, we need to pay attention to which direction we're cutting. We need to make sure we have enough room to work with the saw, and we don't want to foul the back of the saw on the bench. Now, if you have a miter saw, and I do have one, and you have a fine-tooth blade for it, which I don't have, you can make this cut just as easily with a miter saw. But if you don't have the luxury of having a miter saw and you're doing this on a budget, then a circular saw with a fine-tooth blade will work just fine. You just have to make sure you get the proper 45-degree angle. Now for the fun part. We get to start putting our die together. Now what I've done for the trim on the long sides is I've custom fitted one to each side just to make absolutely sure they fit in the event there are any lingering imperfections in the wood, and I've scribbled a number on each one. Number 1 for this side and number 2 for the other side. So next thing we do is we take a good wood glue, and I'm using here Type Bond Premium Wood Glue, and we just run a bead of glue down the side of the wood, and then I'm going to lay this on here, and then I'm going to have to wipe off the excess in a minute or so. And very carefully lay this on. Now, I'm not too worried about the excess glue at this point because it takes a while to set up, and once we get this thing clamped down, then we can clean up the excess and worry a little bit more about making it pretty. So this is the other side, side number 2. And now that we have both sides attached, I'm just going to carefully lay this down on the bench and hope these don't move around too much while I'm getting my clamps ready to go. Now, these clamps, and these are 36-inch clamps because I use them on the long sides of the really large ones, but they just have pads and they just go down with a trigger. Sorry, wrong trigger. Okay. So now we'll pull out the other clamp. And then we'll bring that in. And then we'll move it till we get it in position. Okay, this end is pretty good. We're going to fix our little imperfections with the sander later on. So this doesn't have to be totally perfect. And we're just about there. Okay. Now I usually like to let these dry overnight before I move on to the next step. So in the next scene, it'll be tomorrow. This is the top of our die or bonsai table so far. Haven't decided yet which side's going to be the actual top or bottom. We've got the sides trimmed out and the glue is drying pretty nicely, and at this point it just needs some heavy sanding in order to smooth out all the little imperfections. The next step, while we're waiting for the glue to finish drying, it has set up but it's not totally dry, but the next step is to make the legs. Now I have an older, larger die here that I made a few years ago, and I'm using that kind of as a point of reference to give me an idea of what the legs should look like relative to the tabletop. So I've got the legs on this one, and I have a piece of oak lumber here, 2x2, to use to make the legs for the new one, and tape measure and tri-square. So we'll just set this down for just a moment here, and we'll measure these. And on the old one, I made the legs 4 inches long. Now, since the new one is a little bit smaller and is designed for a smaller tree, we're going to make the legs a little bit shorter. And I'm looking at this and thinking 3 inches, 3 1/4 inches is just about right. So we'll take the new tabletop back up here and take a look and just kind of hold the measure up and eyeball it. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking 3 1/4 looks a little long, so 3 inches is what it's going to be. So the next step, now that we decided the legs or feet on this are going to be 3 inches, is to set this aside. And if you'll take a look over here, the other one we did, we've got 2 sides on it glued, and we're waiting for those to dry, and we're going to do the 2 other sides a little bit later on. But getting back to the first one, Here's our piece of oak stock, and we're going to just take a measurement here at 3 inches and then take our tri-square so that we make an absolutely straight mark. Now, because we're going to lie these on our sides, on their sides relative to the tabletop, they don't have to be totally exactly the same length, which makes this a little easier. Now, if we were going to set them up vertically, like I've done on some other dies I've built, then I would have to try to get them to as close as possible so it doesn't wobble when it stands up. I've done that before. There is a technique for doing that, and we will cover that in some future video on making dies. But for now, we're going to mark this off at 3 inches. Then we're going to cut. And instead of marking off 4 3s and then chopping them all at once, my preference is to cut them one at a time, because if you mark 4 and cut 4, you can have errors accumulate along the way and you can have inaccuracies build up. So let me go get the work gloves. I broke down and bought a fine-tooth cutting blade for my miter saw, and I've been using it to cut pieces today as opposed to yesterday when I was cutting them very carefully with a handheld circular saw. Something I learned of interest is that the miter saw, because it uses a 10-inch blade and the circular saw uses a 7 1/4-inch blade, the miter saw's blade is a bit thicker, and that is making a slight difference in how the cuts come out on the wood. So having had a long-term acquaintance with my circular saw and only having had a miter saw in the past year or two, I'm having to adjust the way I do things. And here, this came out literally about 1/16 of an inch shy of 3 inches because of the thickness of the saw blade. So on this one, what I'm going to have to do to adjust for that is I made the mark at 2 15/16 inches, but I'm going to be cutting a bit wide of the mark and see if I can get these things right. I do have enough wood here to do things over and make more leg pieces if I need to, but you know, oak being a little expensive, my preference is to try to get them as close as possible on the first try so that I don't have to do things over and use more wood. Here are the 4 legs. Now they have to be sanded. I'm using 120 grit sandpaper here to just kind of take the edges off and smooth them out a little bit before we start assembly of the die. And there you go. Okay, what we've done, now that we've got all the sides trimmed out on our top, is we've sanded everything smooth using 80 grit sandpaper, and we've got all our side pieces sanded down even with the top. Here's our 4 legs right over here, and in a few minutes we're going to start working on how to attach those to the top. But meanwhile, we have to do a little bit of fixing with the top here. A couple of our trim pieces didn't quite come out perfectly on the corners, but that's not a problem because we've got high performance wood filler that will deal with that just fine. Now, our wood filler is a 2-part epoxy. It's like Bondo that you use on auto bodies, and it's real nasty stuff, makes nasty fumes. So you want to be very careful when mixing it to work only in a well-ventilated area, not breathe it too much. But we just take the stuff and we just put it into the cracks and the gaps, and then after it sets up, we will sand it down. It's pretty simple to use. It may take a second application to fill a gap this size. We've sanded and finished the tabletop. We've cut the legs to size, and we've determined locations for them, and we've taken measurements. We've decided to place each leg 1 1/4 inches inward both directions from each corner. So we have 4 legs, 4 sets of measurements, 4 sets of markings. We also decided that this is going to be the underside of the top because the other side has a bit more interesting grain structure. So the next thing we have to do, and this is the really tricky part, is we have to measure for the locations of the dowels that we're going to use to hold the legs in place, and then we have to very carefully drill the holes for the dowels. This is a fluted hardwood dowel that we're going to use. This drill with a collar on it is what we're going to use to drill the holes, but first we have to determine the locations. Now, the locations can be imprecise on one side, but then when you measure off on the other side, it has to line up exactly or you're going to have a problem. So what I typically like to do is set a leg in place and then find roughly the center line, and then we'll make 2 more marks approximately where we want our dowels. Try to space them out so that they're about right, and then we make some cross lines so that we can figure out the location of the dowels. So these are going to be the drilling locations for the 2 dowels to hold on this leg. Now the next step is we have to transfer our markings onto the leg itself, and this is the easiest way to do this. So we'll just make marks on the sides of the leg and take them over the corners. And then we'll take our little tri-square tool and try to get as much perpendicular on here as we can. And then we draw the line there. And then we need another line here. Now, there's one other little trick to this because we haven't measured these equidistant from both sides. Got to remember when you put this back on, you're going to line up these markings with the ones on the tabletop. So, let's get out a drill, fire it up, drill our holes, and hope that our dowels are going to fit. Now the dowel is going to go a short way into the top because it's not that thick, and a good bit longer into the leg. This is the scary part, because once we do this, there's no turning back. So first, let's make sure the collar is set so that we're not going to go all the way through the wood. And it looks like we're good there. Second, we'll put the point of the drill bit right where we want it. And we're not going to go hog wild here. We're just going to go a little bit at a time, hang on to our patience, and make sure we do this right. The oak is very hard wood, and so the drill goes through it fairly slowly. We've drilled holes in the underside of the tabletop and corresponding holes in the bottom of the leg. The next step is to put a little glue into the holes and then use a mallet to pound the dowels into place. Now that we've got the dowels in and we got plenty of glue, we just pound the leg into place. And after we do the other 3, our stand will be ready for finish sanding and staining. The construction phase of our bonsai die is now finished, and we're putting the final finishing touches on it. I've actually already finish sanded it and stained the underside, And now we're going to stain the top, and we're doing this out in the sun to speed drying time. Now I'm using a one-stage stain and polyurethane here, and we're staining it in kind of an antique maple color because that is what will coordinate with the trees that we anticipate displaying on it. Now the trick with the stain is to plan on doing 2 coats because it's fairly thin going on, and try not to leave brush marks, which is somewhat easier said than done. But the nice thing about this stuff is most of the brush marks will dry out of it. So we just spread it on. And that about finishes our bonsai stand. We're just laying a little bit of last minute touches on here, and then we're going to let this air dry in the sun. And then after it dries overnight, the next and last scene of this video, we'll show it to you with a bonsai on it in a somewhat more formal display setting. Our bonsai die or display stand is finished. We also made a smaller one for the kusamono or companion plant. And I chose this bougainvillea even though it's not quite ready for the show and still needs the top shoot trimmed, which we left on to thicken up the main shoot here. And it also has a little bit of wire on it, but I just wanted to show you give you an idea of what it's going to look like when we present it at the show. And that concludes this video, which actually took nearly a week to produce from the time I first started cutting lumber until this moment here. So hopefully we'll see you at the show. Announcements to follow in the credits. And thank you for watching, folks.